Okay, so now I'm going to move on to actually filing taxes as an independent contractor. Again, very important to note that this is just a very generic sort of overview of how you would file taxes as a first timer, having done work as an independent contractor. Taxes get a lot more complicated with any other business structure, like I mentioned before, like a partnership or an LLC or anything else, a lot more to consider. But this is just to give you a very general overview of what to expect. So really, the number one thing to do is to organize and prepare ahead of time. So the first thing is definitely to look for a reliable tax preparer or an accountant, especially if it's your first time filing as an independent contractor. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some tips to looking for a reliable tax preparer. You need to be prepared to pay both federal and state taxes. So there are some online tax bracket calculators that you can use to figure out how much you would be paying. So the differences between an employee and an independent contractor is that as an employee, your employer is responsible for a portion of those taxes, and it's automatically taken out with in every one of your checks, whereas an independent contractor, you get paid the full amount. So that means that you're held responsible to pay for all of those taxes. So it's important to just be aware that you will need to be paying these taxes. I know it may be, it'll get really exciting when you get those checks, but just you have to keep in mind that you have to be paying a portion of those checks. And I'll talk a little bit more about everything that needs to be paid. So you should definitely organize all of your income, both as an employee, if you're working as an employee with work authorization, and as an independent contractor. So in my case, I am currently employed as an employee. I am a DACA recipient, so I have a work authorization to work as an employee, but I also work as an independent contractor. So at the end of the year, what I've been doing now actually is organizing all of the W-2s I receive for my work done as an employee. I'm actually employed by different organizations to work as an employee, and I do independent contractor work on the side. So every year I end up with about 3 different W-2s and multiple 1099s for work done as an independent contractor. So even throughout the year, I'm very careful about making sure I keep track of all my independent contractor work, keeping track of all the W-9s I'm submitting to the different clients, keeping track of all the checks I'm receiving. You will only receive the 1099s from clients who you have made business with $600 or more. However, you still need to report income even for small jobs that are done separately. So again, in the first webinar, I talked a little bit about some of these forms, so I will go over them in a couple of slides just to give you a general breakdown of all the forms that are needed to file your taxes. Another thing that you need to organize and prepare are your business expenses. So this is something that actually no one ever told me when I started working as an independent contractor, that I can actually have expenses and deductions. So in a couple of slides, I'll be talking specifically about these business expenses and deductions. Something else that is recommended is to pay quarterly estimated taxes. So this is really for individuals who are expected to pay $1,000 or more when you file an annual return. And in order to pay these quarterly estimates, you can use the IRS Form 1040 to file your estimated taxes, and a link to this form is provided in your handout. There are 2 different ways that you can pay. You may pay using the federal government online payment system or direct pay. And again, this is just very general overview of how one might begin to organize to pay for your taxes as an independent contractor. Similar to immigration services, you should be very careful when choosing a taxpayer. You don't want to become a victim to any scheme that offers unrealistic wealth or exemption from your obligations to file tax returns and/or pay taxes. Most taxpayers probably provide excellent and honest service to their clients, but there are a few unscrupulous tax return preparers that file false and fraudulent tax returns and ultimately defraud their clients. So it's important to know that even if someone else prepares your return, you are ultimately responsible for all the information on the tax return, which is why it is very important to choose your tax preparer wisely. So this is actually a checklist offered by the IRS when looking for a tax preparer. So you definitely want to, Google those persons' qualifications, make sure that they actually know what they're doing. Check the tax preparer's history. Now there are a lot of websites that actually rate some of these individuals to see, to make sure that you're working with someone that's trustworthy. Find out about the service fees ahead of time. You don't want to be overpaying either. Ask if they offer electronic filing. That really expedites the process in terms of submitting your taxes. Make sure the tax preparer is accessible. So you really want to make sure that you have a close relationship with this person, in the sense that you can call them or send them a text message, send them an email if you have any questions. Definitely, for folks who are doing taxes for the first time as an independent contractor, you will definitely have a lot of questions. So you want to make sure that that person is accessible and can answer questions in an adequate time. You do need to provide all records and receipts needed to prepare your return. So again, very important to think about this before looking for the tax preparer. Never sign a blank return. You always want to make sure that everything is on there, want to be double checking everything. You want to make sure you're reviewing and signing everything ahead of time. So that's why it's important to, you may not necessarily have to know all the forms that are necessary. You may not necessarily know exactly what needs to be there, but at least just knowing what the forms look like and the type of information that you will be asked to get, at least just to have an idea to make sure that everything on your taxes is correct. And then make sure that once the tax preparer does complete your taxes, that the tax preparer provides his or her tax identification number. This way, if any questions come up about who filed this, you can directly point to that person. So here's an overview of all the different forms that you need to file your taxes. So in the last webinar, I talked about the W-9 1099 form, but just to briefly go over them again. So the W-9 form is the form that you will be asked to submit by clients or by different clients for them to keep track of how much money they are paying you. So again, this form can be requested by all the different clients that you work with. So you might be submitting, anywhere from 1 to 5 to 10 different W-9 forms, depending on the number of clients that you're working with. This is the form that would take the place of an I-9. An I-9 is the one that is submitted as an employee that requires work authorization and validation of identity. Whereas the W-9 form simply asks for your name, address, the type of business structure that you have, or whether you're working as an independent contractor, and either a social security number or a tax ID number. Again, this one does not ask at all for work authorization. So the 1099 form is a summary of how much a client or the number of clients paid you if it is more than $600. So at the end of the year, you will get the same number of 1099s as the number of W-9s that you submitted, which is why it's very important to keep track of who you've been sending these W-9 forms, so you can keep track of how many 1099 forms you are receiving. Again, you are not responsible for doing anything with the 1099 form. That is the responsibility of your clients to mail to you. And this is the form that you use to file your taxes. And then in addition to that, some of the other forms, really your tax preparer is the one that should be keeping track of these forms and should be much more familiar with them. But this is just for you as an individual to know what forms are used when reporting taxes as an independent contractor. So the form that is used to report self-employment income is Form 1040. The next form that I'm going to talk about is the Schedule C Easy form. So this is the form that is used to calculate your net profit from businesses. So this is typically used for smaller businesses with expenses of less than $5,000. This is used if you don't have any employees, if you don't have physical inventory, and if you're not depreciating or deducting cost of your home. And I'll talk a little bit more about expenses in the next slide so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. And then the Schedule C form is basically the same as the previous form, but it's used for more complex businesses. And it's used to calculate the profit or loss from a business. And all of this is what ultimately gives a final number for you to pay taxes on. And then lastly, there's Schedule SE form, which is used to determine how much you pay in Social Security and Medicare taxes in addition to the income tax. So again, very important to know that as an employee, your employer typically pays a portion of your income tax, also pays for some Social Security or Medicare taxes, whereas an independent contractor, you're responsible to pay for all of that. So really important again to understand that once you begin to do work as an independent contractor, that has to be in the back of your mind, that at all times you need to know that you have to pay taxes either at the end of the year or quarterly, depending on how much money you're making. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about expenses and deductions. So expenses and deductions are very important because at the end of the year, from your income, you can actually include expenses and deductions that will lower your income, that will lower the percent of taxes that you need to pay. So this can get a little bit tricky and complicated because the eligible expenses and deductions vary by the type of business that you have, the type of business structure. So it does require working with a tax preparer who is familiar with how to handle this, and also, again, who is familiar with the type of business that you are conducting. But in general, this gives you a general overview of what some eligible expenses and deductions are. So in general, advertising expenses, so if you're doing maybe some Facebook marketing, if you're doing business cards, anything like that to promote your business, that can be used as an expense. Business insurances, depending again on the type of business you have. Interest paid on business credit card, on business loans, can also be expensed. Professional services, so if you hire a lawyer for some type of consulting, accountants, tax preparers, so all those fees could actually become part of your business expenses. Requests for equipment, so anytime you send your computer, your cell phone, anything that you're using for your business for repair, that also counts as an expense. Office supplies, pretty much anything that you can think of in terms of office supplies that can help you in your individual business can count as a business expense. Travel costs, so I do quite a bit of travel when I do consult with individuals, so I expense a mileage fee on my car as well as some of the expenses related to my car. But in addition to that, if you have to fly or any type of lodging, that could also become an expense. Business meals and other entertainment are also, you can also count as an expense. You can do 50% of business meals and entertainment as an expense. And other ones that I recently found out about actually are student loan interest deductions. So I am paying a small student loan, and so the interest on that I can actually deduct from my taxes. There are also additional tax benefits for education. And so I put in the handout specific links that talk more about these different types of deductions to determine whether or not you're eligible. And then one thing I did want to make a note of is that undocumented immigrants are exempt from the Affordable Care Act tax penalty. So the next slide is about the importance of managing cash flow and saving for taxes. So as I mentioned before, as an independent contractor, at the end of the year, you will be held responsible for paying your taxes, and for paying, maybe additional liabilities. So here are just sort of some tips to help you manage your tax liabilities at the end of the year. So one of the first things that you want to do is that you are making sure you're charging enough as an independent contractor to cover business expenses and taxes. So it's important to determine your hourly rate and billable hours. So I did include a link to how you might want to do something like this. So you do have to include, how much it is that you need to make in order to pay for all of your taxes and liabilities. And then, there's a whole other calculation that you can do to determine how many hours you actually have to be billing per year to be able to meet everything that you have to pay. I suggest creating a budget to plan estimated expenses and revenues. So I typically do about a monthly budget where I include all my expenses and then figure out how much I need to be making. So, which is why, it's really almost a balancing act when you're working as an employee with if your work authorization and as an independent contractor, because now I sort of manage my time that I can work as an employee and my time that I work as an independent contractor. Before, when I used to do only independent contractor work, I really had to think about, okay, how do I need to increase my clients or increase the work I'm doing to offset all of my expenses. So I definitely recommend creating a monthly budget if you can, to figure out how much it is that you need to be making, or whether you need to sort of ramp up on your independent contractor work. You may also want to forecast to keep your finances in check. So in addition to having a monthly budget, try to forecast a couple of months ahead, just so you can, have, a little bit of cushion room when thinking about how much money it is that you need to be saving, or how much money you need to be making. Track your cash flow by keeping track of when you're expected to get paid and when you need to pay your liabilities. So another sort of challenge with working as an independent contractor is that you don't know, it may take some time for some of your clients to pay you. So there may be some paperwork that needs to be processed, that needs to go through different parties within a company. So you need to be sort of keeping track of that with all the different clients that you have. It is recommended for you to set aside at least 25% of your earned income to pay taxes. And again, this is the part where, it's really important that you are charging the correct amount of money per hour, because, you are going to be getting, all these great checks, but you have to be aware of the fact that you do have to set money aside, whether you like it or not, to pay for those taxes quarterly or at the end of the year. So one of the tips I suggest is perhaps opening a savings account specifically for tax purposes. And there are actually lots of great resources online that you can check out that can help you budget specifically for taxes. So you can even do a Google search for services that help you save money, or that automatically can give you an estimate of how much money you need to be putting aside depending on how much money is coming in. And then another tip is to be careful with credit cards and interest rates. So as an independent contractor, you can get credit cards, you can get credit loans. Once you expand into a business, you can get business loans, but it's always just important to keep track of the interest rates and to keep track of, how much money you're putting into that. And just lastly, I wanted to give you some updates for the current tax season. So the tax filing deadline is a few days later. It's typically on April 15th. It's now on April 18th, which gives us all a few extra days to file our taxes. Anybody who does have an ITIN and needs to renew, it is suggested that you renew as soon as possible to avoid refund delays. And then another thing specifically for independent contractors is that the standard mileage was revised to 54 cents per mile, down from 57.5 cents in 2015. So again, this is important to know because when you're calculating your expenses. It's also important to know that there may be other changes for the following year with the new administration. So it's just really important, once you begin doing work as an independent contractor, it's just really important to keep up with all the updates. Like I said, your tax preparer or your accountant should be fully aware of this, but it doesn't hurt for you to know what the forms look like, to know, have sort of a ballpark estimate of how much you're supposed to be paying in taxes, and be aware of all the updates.